Have you ever wondered why a corporate machine worth billions of dollars rarely collapses? It is not because of the slick managers and glass offices, it is because of invisible ghosts like me. We wake up at 4:30 in the morning to clean up the system's mess. My new boss told me to stop arriving early, so I obeyed. Exactly 72 hours later, his prideful empire burned to the ground, and I just smiled. Hello, listeners of Boss Revenge Stories, and thank you from the bottom of my heart for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube recently disabled the monetization feature on our channel, meaning we no longer have the budget to operate. If you find today's story entertaining, please consider supporting us with just $1 so our channel can have the funds to pay our hardworking staff, allowing them to cover their living expenses and continue creating the stories you love. You can easily support us by scanning the QR code right on your screen, or by clicking the donation link down in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let me introduce you to Abigail Parker. I am Abigail Parker. I am 32 years old, and I serve as the dispatch lead at Meridian Freight and Logistics, a massive, heavy-hitting transport and supply chain empire anchored right in the gritty heart of downtown Chicago. If you have ever ordered a package online and marveled when it arrived at your front porch the very next morning, you can thank places exactly like Meridian, but do not direct your gratitude toward the executives in their tailored suits. You need to thank the invisible people standing on the cold concrete. My morning routine is a violent awakening every single day. My alarm buzzes against my nightstand at 4:30 in the morning. By 5:15, long before the sun even considers creeping up over the dark waters of Lake Michigan, I am turning a heavy metal key in the lock of a colossal, freezing warehouse. The air inside always hits my lungs with the same familiar scent. It smells like diesel exhaust, damp corrugated cardboard, and stale break room coffee. The floor stretches out like a mechanical ocean of steel conveyor belts, sorting chutes, and towering loading bays. When I first walk in, the building is dead silent. But do not let that fool you. It is a deceptive, heavy silence. It is the quiet of a loaded gun just waiting for the trigger to be pulled. The upper management at Meridian loves to boast to their wealthy shareholders about our multi-million-dollar automated artificial intelligence routing system. They call it the absolute pinnacle of modern logistics. I call it a shiny, expensive pile of digital garbage. Sure, when you look at it on a high-definition monitor in a heated corporate boardroom, the algorithm appears flawless. It draws neat, colorful lines across a digital map. But out here in the unforgiving real world, that artificial intelligence is dangerously blind. It does not know that Interstate 90 is backed up for 12 miles because of unannounced overnight road construction. It cannot feel the heavy barometric pressure dropping right before a brutal Chicago blizzard buries the asphalt. It certainly does not care that a driver has been gripping a steering wheel for 10 hours straight and is running entirely on fumes and caffeine. Because of this, I deliberately steal 90 minutes of my own life every single morning to clean up the machine's catastrophic messes. From 5:15 until my shift officially begins, I sit in my cramped, drafty dispatch booth, overlooking the dark floor, and I initiate hundreds of manual overrides. I am essentially a trauma surgeon operating on a bleeding system. I manually reroute 40 different outbound trucks, dragging their designated paths away from traffic nightmares and dangerous weather fronts. I walk down to Section C to forcefully recalibrate the optical barcode scanners, which have a nasty habit of jamming up whenever the warehouse temperature drops below 40 degrees. Most crucially, I hunt down the emergency medical freight. The algorithm is incredibly stupid. It treats a highly sensitive shipment of life-saving surgical equipment the exact same way it treats a bulk pallet of cheap plastic toys. I have to manually dig those medical pallets out of the digital queue and push them to the very front of the loading dock so they leave first. Not a single word of this is written in my employment contract. I do not receive a single dime of overtime pay for waking up before the rest of the city. Yet, those 90 minutes of unrecorded, unpaid labor are the only actual wall standing between Meridian Freight and total operational destruction. You might be asking why I do it. Why give a billion-dollar company my free time? I do it because I'm addicted to the control. I love the deep, steady rhythm of massive machinery working exactly the way it was designed to work. But more importantly, I do it to protect my drivers. I refuse to let the men and women under my watch suffer on icy, gridlocked highways just because a piece of Silicon Valley software made a blind calculation. But this is the tragic irony of working in the shadows. When you do your job so perfectly that disaster never strikes, people assume the system is just magically taking care of itself. Everyone at the corporate level takes my daily miracles for granted. They review the quarterly reports. They see that every truck departed on time, and they praise their beloved technology. They genuinely believe the computers run the world. To the elite executives sitting up in their glass towers, I am nothing. I am just a blurry, invisible ghost haunting the warehouse, keeping their empire intact. And I was perfectly happy being a ghost, until a new boss arrived and decided he wanted to optimize me out of existence. Enter Chadwick Sterling. He was our newly appointed Chief Operating Officer, freshly transplanted from some hyperinflated tech startup in Silicon Valley that probably sold an application for premium dog walking. Chadwick was the kind of guy who wore immaculate, spotless white sneakers paired with tailored navy blue suits. He possessed a vocabulary consisting entirely of corporate buzzwords, speaking fluent jargon like it was a second language. To him, phrases like synergistic alignment, agile deployment, and frictionless scalability were absolute holy scripture. He did not see the logistics warehouse as a living, breathing ecosystem of heavy grease, human sweat, and grinding steel. He saw it exclusively as a dashboard of metrics on his expensive tablet. To Chadwick, human beings were nothing more than unpredictable data anomalies that needed to be ironed out to make his quarterly cost-cutting charts look prettier. During his very first week, Chadwick decided to descend from his climate-controlled corporate heaven to grace the dirty warehouse floor with his presence. It was an unmitigated disaster. He paraded around the logistics bays, actively dismantling every manual process he could find. He confiscated our physical clipboards, banned the use of handwritten dispatch notes, and commanded that every single supervisor trust the artificial intelligence routing software 100%. He gathered the tired floor managers for a mandatory stand-up meeting and boldly declared that human intuition was a fatal bottleneck to corporate velocity. We were told to stop thinking and let the algorithm do the heavy lifting. It did not take long for his precious analytical software to flag a so-called inefficiency. While monitoring the facility security logs from his desk, Chadwick discovered a pattern that ruined his perfect data models. My keycard, every single morning, right on the dot. My badge was registering at the security gate at 5:15 in the morning, even though my official paid shift did not begin until 7 o'clock. I was summoned to his office on a Tuesday. His glass-walled sanctuary hovered above the warehouse floor, completely soundproofed against the noise of the real work happening below. When I walked in, the air smelled intensely of expensive sandalwood cologne and whatever organic kombucha he was currently sipping from a silver reusable thermos. He was leaning back in an ergonomic mesh chair that probably cost more than my monthly rent, staring intently at a glowing monitor. "Abigail, take a seat," he said, gesturing vaguely toward a chair without bothering to make actual eye contact. He finally looked up, offering a tight smile that did not even come close to reaching his eyes. "I have been reviewing the facility access logs for the past quarter. We need to have a quick alignment regarding your personal bandwidth and energy optimization." I sat perfectly still, keeping my face entirely neutral. Alignment about what, exactly? Chadwick sighed, adopting the condescending tone of a disappointed kindergarten teacher who had never broken a sweat doing a day of physical labor in his entire life. "Your entry times. You are clocking in nearly 2 hours before your shift actually begins. Now, I appreciate the hustle, Abigail, but this rogue behavior is severely skewing our operational performance metrics. When my software analyzes the building energy consumption and our overtime liability models, your early presence creates a massive statistical variance. It makes me look bad to the board of directors because it triggers unnecessary flags about insurance liabilities and unauthorized facility usage. I stared at him, trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of his ignorance. I thought about the 40 heavy transport trucks I had manually rerouted just that morning to avoid a multi-vehicle pileup on the frozen expressway. I thought about the fragile medical supplies I had pushed through the jammed optical scanners so a regional hospital would not run out of critical surgical inventory. I could have explained all of this. I could have laid out the brutal truth about how his flawless software was practically steering our drivers off a cliff every single morning. But I looked at his smug, manicured face, and I realized he would never listen. He was a man who worshipped a digital god, and any truth that contradicted his perfectly clean dashboard was considered heresy. So, I chose silence. Chadwick leaned forward, resting his elbows on his pristine mahogany desk, and delivered the ultimate ultimatum. From tomorrow onward, you are strictly forbidden from arriving early. You need to leverage the artificial intelligence. Let the system do what we paid millions of dollars for it to do. You step through those front doors at 6:55, not a minute earlier. Is that crystal clear? Instead of arguing, instead of defending the life-saving shipments or the highway safety of my drivers, I simply smiled. It was a calm, deeply professional, an entirely hollow smile. I understand completely, I replied, keeping my voice smooth and perfectly compliant. However, since this is a major shift in standard operating procedure and facility access, I would greatly appreciate it if you could send me this exact directive via email. I just want to ensure I can accurately comply with your new protocols without any future misunderstandings. Chadwick scoffed, clearly pleased with how easily he had crushed my supposed blue-collar resistance. His arrogance was absolute. He genuinely believed he had just taught an outdated worker a valuable lesson in modern corporate efficiency. Of course, I will draft the documentation right now. I walked out of his glass cage and descended the metal stairs back to the loud, oily reality of the warehouse floor. By the time I reached my drafty dispatch booth, my computer chimed. It was an email from the desk of Chadwick Sterling. The text was cold, formal, and unambiguous. It explicitly forbade me from entering the premises before 6:55 in the morning and strictly prohibited any manual intervention with the routing software prior to the start of my official shift. I read it twice to make sure his wording was absolutely legally binding. It was perfect. With a few clicks of my mouse, I downloaded that specific email and saved duplicate copies to 3 separate external hard drives. The trap was permanently set. The match had been successfully struck. All I had to do now was wait for the fire to catch. The next morning, the clock on my dashboard flipped to exactly 5:15. For the first time in 6 years, my fingers were not wrapped around a heavy metal key. I was not standing in the freezing darkness of the industrial park, fighting a rusted lock to let myself into a cold, hollow building. Instead, I was sitting comfortably in the heated leather driver's seat of my sport utility vehicle, parked completely out of sight at the far edge of the employee lot. I had stopped at a 24-hour convenience store on the way in. I held a large, warm caramel macchiato in my hands, taking slow, deliberate sips. Through the premium speakers of my car, a smooth, slow-tempo jazz track was playing. It was a piece by Miles Davis. The muted trumpet felt incredibly fitting for a funeral. And make no mistake about it, I was attending a corporate funeral. I just happened to be watching the burial unfold on the glowing screen of my company-issued tablet, safely propped up against my steering wheel. At precisely 6 o'clock, the multi-million-dollar automated routing system woke up. This was the exact moment I usually intervened, the moment I normally jumped into the digital trenches to save the company from its own expensive stupidity. But today, my hands stayed firmly wrapped around my coffee cup. I sat back and watched the screen as the artificial intelligence blindly pushed its master schedules down to the tablets of over 50 different transport drivers. It was a breathtaking masterpiece of digital incompetence. I watched the blue dot representing transport truck number 14 receive its designated route. The software coldly directed the driver to take the old industrial bridge across the river to reach the western suburbs. The algorithm, trapped in its perfect digital vacuum, did not know that the Department of Transportation had completely shut that bridge down for heavy structural maintenance 48 hours ago. That driver was going to hit a massive concrete barricade, attempt to reverse a fully loaded 53-foot trailer through a narrow residential zone, and easily lose at least 3 hours of drive time. Next, my eyes drifted to the outbound routing queue for loading dock number 4. Truck number 9 was carrying temperature-sensitive, highly volatile pharmaceutical vaccines. The algorithm, prioritizing raw volume over cargo type, slotted it squarely behind a massive flatbed hauling raw construction materials. The vaccine truck was now effectively trapped in the loading bay queue, forced to idle helplessly while warehouse workers struggled to maneuver tons of heavy steel rebar. Every single minute it sat there in the loading queue, the risk of a catastrophic temperature excursion climbed higher and higher. The dashboard clock ticked to 6:30. From my secure vantage point in the parking lot, I could clearly see the massive frosted glass windows of the main sorting facility. Usually, they glowed with a steady, productive white light. Today, a violent, strobing red flash began to pulse aggressively against the glass. It was starting. Section C was failing. The optical barcode scanners had jammed. Right on schedule. Whenever the ambient temperature of the warehouse dropped, the pneumatic air compressor required a firm manual reset to clear the accumulated cardboard dust and keep the optical belts moving. But I was not there to press the heavy green override button. Without the compressor, the main conveyor belt triggered an automatic safety shutdown. The violent red lights meant the system was choking on its own freight. The secondary automated lines were blindly dumping heavy boxes onto a completely stationary belt, creating a crushing, disorganized mountain of ruined cardboard and shattered inventory. The jazz track finally faded out. The digital clock on my dashboard struck 6:55. It was time. I took one final sip of my sugary coffee, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the biting Chicago wind. I took my time. I carefully smoothed the wrinkles from my dark wool coat. I adjusted the collar of my shirt. I walked across the frozen asphalt with the slow, deliberate pacing of an executioner stepping up to the block. I approached the main security terminal, pulled my identification badge from my pocket, and swiped it against the reader. The machine beeped, officially recording my entry at exactly the precise minute my boss had demanded in writing. I pushed open the heavy steel double doors and stepped onto the warehouse floor. It was like walking onto a chaotic battlefield where the commanding officers had all surrendered to the enemy. I strolled through the facility like a high-fashion model, commanding a runway that just happened to be completely engulfed in invisible flames. The ambient noise was absolutely deafening. The warning sirens from the jammed conveyor belts in Section C were screaming at full volume, echoing harshly off the metal ceiling. A thick, frustrated knot of heavily caffeinated, angry truck drivers was gathered around the dispatch desk, screaming profanities at the blank computer monitors. Heavy wooden pallets of freight were stacked chaotically in the primary transport aisles, blocking the forklifts, creating a massive, tangled knot of steel, rubber, and cardboard. It was total, beautiful, unadulterated gridlock. Suddenly, a frantic figure burst out from the heavy fire doors leading down from the executive suites. It was Chadwick. His perfectly tailored navy suit looked rumpled and entirely out of place. His face, usually a mask of smug corporate confidence, was drained of all blood. He looked absolutely pale, like a man who had just watched his entire career evaporate into thin air. He was clutching his silver thermos of kombucha so tightly, his knuckles were completely white. He practically sprinted across the chaotic concrete floor, narrowly dodging an aggressive forklift driver, until he reached my dispatch booth. He was panting heavily, his panicked eyes darting wildly around the disastrous scene unfolding around him. He looked at me, completely bewildered, his voice cracking sharply as he yelled over the blaring mechanical alarms. "Abigail, what in the world is happening down here? Why are the scanning lines completely down? Why are the drivers still sitting in the yard? Why is absolutely nothing ready?" I stood there, perfectly composed amidst the screaming sirens, the burning rubber, and the shouting drivers. I slowly raised my left wrist and deliberately tapped the glass of my watch with my index finger. I looked him dead in the eye and offered the most innocent, polite smile I could possibly muster. "Good morning, boss," I said, my voice incredibly calm and completely steady. "It is exactly 7 o'clock. I have just started my shift. Exactly per your official directive." The fire did not stay contained within the concrete walls of the warehouse. It leaped out of the heavy loading docks and spilled directly onto the unforgiving asphalt of the city. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the situation had escalated from a localized logistical delay into a full-blown metropolitan crisis. The artificial intelligence, running completely unchecked and utterly blind to the reality of the morning rush hour, had routed our heavy transport vehicles directly into the worst traffic bottlenecks imaginable. It was an absolute digital slaughter. I sat calmly at my dispatch terminal and watched the enormous high-definition tracking monitor mounted on the main wall. Usually, the electronic map was covered in smoothly moving green dots, representing a perfectly synchronized ballet of corporate logistics. Now, it looked like a massive digital wound bleeding out across the grid. 45% of the entire Meridian fleet was completely paralyzed. Dozens of 18-wheelers were wedged tight in narrow downtown alleys they never should have entered. Others were trapped in bumper-to-bumper gridlock on the interstate, burning expensive diesel fuel by the gallon while moving absolutely nowhere. My radio console lit up like a warning beacon. It was a chaotic, deafening chorus of pure, unadulterated rage. Drivers were screaming over the static, demanding alternate routes, cursing the machine, and asking why dispatch had seemingly abandoned them to the wolves. I listened to the static. I let it burn. But traffic jams were just the opening act of this disaster. The real catastrophe was quietly brewing inside the specialized cold chain fleet. We had 3 massive refrigerated trailers sitting completely immobile in the staging yard. They were loaded to the ceiling with highly sensitive, immensely expensive medical biologicals. Normally, during the brutal early morning cold, the external compressor valves would freeze shut. I always walked out there at 5:30, manually cleared the ice, and forced a physical reset of the pneumatic pumps to ensure the internal temperatures remained perfectly stable. But today, following my new executive orders, I had stayed in my warm car. Without that crucial human intervention, the frozen valves locked up completely. The trailer's digital temperature gauges began to plummet rapidly. Piercing alarms started shrieking across the dispatch board. The temperature inside those 3 trailers dropped far below the strictly mandated safety threshold. Millions of dollars worth of critical liquid biologicals were actively freezing, crystallizing, and becoming utterly worthless right there in our own parking lot. The algorithm saw the temperature drop. The algorithm logged the temperature drop in its pristine database. The algorithm did absolutely nothing to fix it, because an algorithm cannot swing a heavy wrench to break off a thick layer of ice. Then, the telephones began to ring. It was not a normal, polite ringing. It was a frantic, unceasing barrage of incoming calls from the executive account management floor. The corporate customer service representatives were drowning in fury. And then, the red emergency hotline sitting directly on my desk lit up. It was Apex Medical. They were our ultimate very important client, an absolute titan of the healthcare industry that single-handedly generated 30% of Meridian's total annual corporate revenue. The voice on the other end of the line was not a low-level logistics coordinator. It was a senior hospital administrator, and he was absolutely screaming until his voice went hoarse. A highly specialized, custom-manufactured surgical kit for a pediatric heart transplant was supposed to be delivered to their surgical wing at 8 o'clock sharp. The pediatric patient was already prepped. The surgical team was scrubbed in and waiting in the operating room. But the equipment was not there. The artificial intelligence, optimizing strictly for fuel efficiency rather than critical medical priority, had buried the life-saving heart transplant equipment deep inside the belly of a truck that was currently trapped behind a broken-down garbage truck in a narrow alleyway on the south side of Chicago. The hospital administrator was threatening massive lawsuits. He was threatening to pull every single contract immediately. He was threatening to destroy Meridian entirely. The sheer gravity of the disaster finally shattered Chadwick's sterling. His polished, arrogant Silicon Valley facade completely cracked, revealing the terrified, incompetent amateur hiding underneath the expensive Navy suit. He was no longer using words like synergistic alignment or frictionless scalability. He was simply panicking. I watched him sprint out of his glass office and literally run down the hallway toward the information technology department. He threw open their doors and started shrieking at the stunned engineers. He demanded that they force the algorithm to correct the routes. He was slamming his perfectly manicured hands down on their keyboards, spilling hot coffee across their desks, screaming at the monitors as if the machine could somehow hear and obey his frantic orders. He demanded that the artificial intelligence fix itself immediately. But artificial intelligence does not possess an ego. It does not feel fear. It just executes rigid code. The engineers stared at him in absolute horror, trying to explain that the system was operating exactly as it was programmed to operate. It was optimizing. The fact that the optimization was actively destroying the company was completely irrelevant to the machine. Realizing the computers could not save him, Chadwick scrambled back down to the warehouse floor and rushed to my dispatch booth. He was sweating profusely. His tailored suit jacket was discarded somewhere on the floor. His tie was ripped loose, and his eyes were bloodshot and wild with panic. He slammed his palms onto my desk, gasping heavily for air. "Abigail," he pleaded, his voice trembling with sheer terror. "You have to fix this right now. Override the system. Manually reroute the medical trucks out of the yard. Get the Apex shipment out of that alleyway. I do not care how you do it. Just fix everything immediately." I looked up at him. I did not blink. I reached slowly into my desk drawer and pulled out the thick, heavy company binder detailing the official standard operating procedures. "I would love to help, boss," I said softly, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "But as you strictly reminded me yesterday, I must adhere entirely to the approved corporate protocols. According to the manual, a manual route override requires a thorough safety evaluation, a structural load check, and a secondary dispatcher approval." I opened the heavy binder and placed my fingers on my mechanical keyboard. Standard processing time for a manual override is 1 trip per 15 minutes. I will begin processing truck number 1 now. Chadwick looked like he was going to have a massive stroke right there on the concrete floor. "Skip the protocols," he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "Skip the safety evaluations. Just push the damn routes through. Force them out right now." I shook my head slowly, projecting an aura of absolute, unwavering compliance. "I am deeply sorry, Chadwick, but I absolutely cannot do that. Skipping safety protocols to rush a dispatch violates the strict liability metrics you emailed me about yesterday. You specifically prohibited rogue behavior and unapproved manual intervention. I am simply optimizing my compliance to your new standards." I turned back to my screen. I processed exactly 1 truck every 15 minutes. No more, no less. I typed with agonizing, deliberate slowness. Clack, pause, clack. Every single keystroke was another nail in his professional coffin. I watched him pace frantically behind me, pulling at his hair, watching his entire career burn down in exact 15-minute increments. By the time the afternoon sun began to dip below the cold city skyline, the destruction was absolute and irreversible. The estimated financial losses for a single day of botched operations were astronomical, climbing rapidly well into the high 7 figures. The warehouse floor was a silent graveyard of delayed, ruined freight. The atmosphere inside the entire Meridian building was incredibly thick and heavy. You could practically taste the raw, unbridled anger radiating from the stranded drivers, mixed perfectly with the suffocating, cold terror sweating out of the upper management team. The billion-dollar corporate machine had crashed headfirst into a brick wall at full speed. And it was all because one invisible ghost decided to follow the rules exactly as they were written. By the 3rd day of the ongoing disaster, the air inside the Meridian logistics facility was toxic. The initial panic had hardened into a cold, grim exhaustion. The loading docks were still severely bottlenecked, and the financial bleeding had not stopped. Up in his glass office, Chadwick Sterling was no longer pacing or shouting. He had gone completely still. It was the terrifying, predatory stillness of a cornered animal realizing it was about to be slaughtered. He knew his tenure as chief operating officer was effectively over unless he could find a human shield to absorb the fatal blow. His pristine algorithms had failed. His cost-cutting metrics were a joke, and his grand tech startup philosophy had burned a massive hole through the company treasury. His basic, cowardly survival instinct kicked in. He needed a scapegoat, and he immediately set his sights on the easiest target he could find: me. Chadwick retreated into the dark, slimy world of corporate politics. He spent Thursday secretly colluding with the Human Resources Department behind closed doors. He was frantically building a fabricated paper trail to save his own skin. Through my dispatch terminal, I could see the digital footprints of his inquiries into my employment file. He was drafting a formal termination dossier, meticulously painting me as the sole architect of the entire crisis. He typed up vicious, completely falsified reports accusing me of intentional negligence of duty. He documented that I possessed a toxic, anti-technology attitude that fundamentally undermined corporate progress. Worst of all, he outright lied, stating on the official record that I had maliciously refused to provide critical support during an active operational crisis. His strategy was cowardly but incredibly effective in the corporate world. He was going to fire me on Friday afternoon, hand my severed head on a silver platter to the board of directors, and claim that a rogue, disgruntled blue-collar employee had sabotaged his otherwise flawless automated system. He thought I was just a naive warehouse worker passively waiting for the guillotine to fall. He was entirely wrong. While Chadwick was busy whispering lies to human resources, I was spending my 3 days of perfectly compliant, strictly scheduled shifts executing a lethal counterstrike. Before Chadwick arrived at this company, I always had to manually erase the artificial intelligence error logs every morning after I fixed the routes, simply to clear the server space. The system never formally recorded its own sheer stupidity because I always caught it before it could fail. But over these last 3 days, because I was strictly following his written orders to do absolutely nothing before 7 o'clock, the algorithm had operated without its invisible safety net. The machine had freely generated a massive, unfiltered, and highly detailed history of its own catastrophic failures. I sat quietly in my drafty dispatch booth and harvested every single piece of that damning data. I downloaded the exact geospatial logs showing the software sending heavy trucks into concrete barricades. I pulled the raw thermal sensor data proving the system completely ignored the freezing temperatures in the medical trailers. I extracted the precise timestamps of the optical barcode crashes. I compiled every single byte of this undeniable proof into a highly secure, encrypted digital portfolio. I named the file Project Sunrise to complete the trap. I dug into the corporate server archives and retrieved every single boastful, arrogant email Chadwick had sent to the upper management over the past 2 months. I placed his extravagant claims about the absolute perfection of his technology directly next to the hard, irrefutable data of its utter failure. I built a financial and operational murder weapon, and I kept it safely stored on a small black flash drive hidden right inside my pocket. The climax arrived on Friday. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the atmosphere in the building violently shifted. Julian Vance, the ruthless chief executive officer of Meridian Freight and Logistics, bypassed all normal protocol and landed his private jet directly at the Chicago airport. He marched into the facility without a word to anyone and immediately summoned a red alert crisis summit in the main executive boardroom. Julian was a man who cared exclusively about shareholder value, and his company was currently hemorrhaging cash at an unprecedented rate. I was officially ordered to attend the meeting. When I walked into the grand, imposing room, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Julian Vance sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his face carved out of pure stone. Chadwick sat to his right, clutching his thick stack of fabricated termination papers, practically sweating through his expensive suit. But the most terrifying presence in the room was not physically there. On the massive, high-definition video wall dominating the far end of the boardroom, The senior executive team from Apex Medical stared down at us. Their lead corporate attorneys were sitting right next to them. They were not calling to negotiate or demand an apology. They were joining this call with the explicit intention of publicly severing their massive contract and burying Meridian in lawsuits. The trap was fully loaded. The players were all in the room, and Chadwick Sterling was eagerly preparing to pull the trigger on himself. The atmosphere inside the glass-walled executive boardroom was suffocating. Chadwick Sterling was sweating profusely, the heavy drops rolling down his forehead and staining the collar of his expensive white shirt. Desperation had entirely consumed him. He stood up abruptly, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face, and launched his premeditated attack in front of the chief executive officer and the furious executives from Apex Medical on the video monitor. "Julian, gentlemen from Apex, I assure you the software is fundamentally sound." Chadwick projected his voice, practically shouting to mask his panic. "The root cause of this entire disaster is sitting right across this table. Abigail Parker is a toxic, old-thinking employee. She actively destroys innovation. She maliciously neglected her duties during a critical operational window, deliberately allowing the system to stall just to prove a petty point against modern technology." I sat perfectly still. I let his desperate, cowardly words hang in the heavy air of the boardroom. I did not interrupt him. I did not raise my voice in defense. When he finally ran out of breath and collapsed back into his chair, breathing heavily, the entire room fell into a dead, absolute silence. Slowly, I reached down and unlatched my briefcase. I pulled out a small, black external flash drive. I stood up, walked calmly over to the main multimedia console, and plugged it directly into the projector system. I did not offer a long, defensive speech. I simply clicked my mouse once. The massive high-definition screen behind Chadwick instantly shifted. I displayed exactly one image for the entire room to read. It was a high-resolution scan of the formal email Chadwick had sent me on Tuesday. His digital signature was stamped at the bottom. The text was magnified, highlighting his exact words in bold black letters. It strictly forbade me from intervening with the automated system and explicitly commanded me not to step through the facility doors before 6:55 in the morning. Julian Vance, a ruthless corporate predator who had built this empire from the ground up, leaned forward. His eyes narrowed as he read the undeniable proof of his chief operating officer's sheer arrogance. The color instantly drained from Chadwick's face. Before Chadwick could utter a single excuse, I clicked the mouse a second time. Project Sunrise illuminated the screen. I deployed the massive data comparison I had compiled over the last 3 days. "The truth, gentlemen, is that this multi-million-dollar algorithm has been fundamentally broken since the very first day it was installed," I stated, my voice echoing coldly off the glass walls. "The artificial intelligence is entirely blind to physical reality. For the past 6 months, the only thing keeping this entire corporation from drowning in federal lawsuits was exactly 90 minutes of unpaid, unrecorded manual labor that I performed every single morning before the sun even came up." I turned my back to Chadwick and looked directly into the camera lens, addressing the furious executives from Apex Medical. "To our most valued partners at Apex, your pediatric surgical kits are highly volatile. They require strict temperature control and immediate priority dispatch. The new routing algorithm evaluated those critical medical requirements as mathematically illogical. To the software, your life-saving equipment was just heavy plastic taking up space. Every single morning, I deliberately overrode the system. I dug your emergency freight out of the digital trash bin and physically routed it to the front of the line. When my boss ordered me to stop doing my job under the threat of termination, the machine simply did what it was programmed to do. It failed you." The lead hospital administrator on the video screen erupted. His face turned crimson with absolute rage as he stared directly at Chadwick. He did not use corporate jargon. He swore, unleashing a brutal verbal assault against Chadwick's incompetence, questioning how a man so profoundly stupid was ever allowed near a logistics facility. Chadwick raised his shaking hands, his voice cracking as his carefully constructed reality shattered into pieces. "Julian, please, You have to understand. It was just a temporary data anomaly. We can optimize the workflow. We can fix the alignment. His words crumbled into pathetic nothingness as the Apex medical representative slammed his fist on his desk. Pointing a finger at the camera, he delivered a brutal, uncompromising ultimatum. Listen to me very carefully. Julian, if this woman named Abigail does not take full executive control of your entire warehouse floor immediately, we are canceling our entire contract with Meridian on Monday morning. That is not a negotiation. Julian Vance did not hesitate for a single second. He did not consult the Human Resources Department. He did not offer a severance package. Julian stood up, walked directly over to Chadwick, and brutally ripped the corporate security badge right off the lanyard around Chadwick's neck. "You are terminated, Chadwick," Julian said, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "Pack your desk and get out of my building right now." Chadwick opened his mouth to speak, but the dead silence in the room crushed him. He stood up, utterly humiliated, and walked out of the glass doors. His prideful empire had burned to the ground in exactly 72 hours. The video call disconnected. The boardroom cleared out. Soon, it was just Julian and me sitting in the quiet, spacious room. Julian reached into his leather portfolio, pulled out a fresh contract, and slid it across the mahogany table. He looked at me with a newfound, profound respect. He offered me the title of Regional Director of Operations. My new salary was exactly 2 times my previous pay rate. Most importantly, the contract included an unrestricted, top-tier security clearance, granting me absolute access to the facility and the routing systems 24 hours a day. I picked up the heavy silver pen resting on the table. I looked at the dotted line, feeling the immense weight of the entire concrete warehouse shifting directly into my hands. I smiled, and I signed my name. The invisible machine finally controlled the light. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please leave a comment and let me know your location. If you found today's story entertaining and satisfying, please consider helping us out with just $1. You can easily scan the QR code right on your screen, or use the donation link in the description or the pinned comment. Your support allows our channel to pay our incredible staff, helping them feed their families and continue bringing you the absolute best revenge stories on the internet. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next one.